once again. Welcome to Trailblazers Hour. My name is Sarah Malanga. I'm sitting here in Malawi, the warm heart of Africa. The Trailblazers series is a youth and young profession-led knowledge space under ShareScreen Africa. It was created to spotlight emerging voices, fresh perspective, and bold leadership shaping our current and future climate and environmental action. The Trailblazers community recognizes that young professionals like us are not just leaders of tomorrow, but they are action drivers of change today. We are continuing where we stopped last week on how we can get to coexistence. I'm now going to hand over to the host of tonight, Dr. Samantha Sitori, who is going to introduce our speaker today and then start the conversation. Samantha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stella, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm joining you from the cold, Harare. I'm so excited to introduce Gabi Fleury. How do I say your surname? I don't want to butcher it. Gabi Fleury?
Fleury, yeah.
Fleury. Gabi Fleury, a conservation biologist, TEDx speaker. Yes, you heard it. TEDx speaker. Come on. And a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Nelson Institute. With over 6 years of experience working across Southern Africa in countries like Kenya, Botswana, South Africa, Gabi has dedicated her career to advancing human-wildlife coexistence through what she calls interspecies diplomacy, an empathy-centered approach to conservation. Her work with livestock producers in Botswana's Kalahari is helping shape innovative, non-lethal solutions to human-carnivore coexistence. And her research has been featured by Forbes, Science Friday, TEDx, Rotary International, and the Fulbright program. I mean, her CV must be crazy, guys. I'm so excited to have her join us on this Trailblazer series all the way from the US in Madison, Wisconsin. Welcome, Gabi. Please, a round of applause, guys. Before we dive into your work, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? You know, what first sparked your interest in conservation and what led you to focus on coexistence between people and wildlife?
Yeah, so my name is Gabriela Fleury. I go by Gabi. I am, as was mentioned, a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so up in the north of the country in the States, close to Canada. And yeah, so why am I into coexistence and what do I do? So I work kind of on the nexus of human-carnivore coexistence issues. I work a lot with people in different countries of sub-Saharan Africa, and I believe a lot in kind of co-designed research projects and community-based solutions. So that's kind of what I'm particularly interested in. You might have heard the term kind of interspecies diplomacy, which I believe was mentioned just a couple minutes ago. That's kind of like what I believe is a really helpful way forward in terms of coexistence research, because it looks at kind of, by saying human-wildlife conflict, it can kind of set up for kind of more of an adversarial position between humans and animals, and it's of course more complex than that. So by looking at diplomacy, it's an ongoing negotiation between people and animals, right? And kind of bringing different voices to the table and trying to have an empathy-forward approach where we can try to think from other perspectives, both human and non-human. So that's kind of what I'm about. I'm currently doing my PhD research in the Kalahari Desert in Botswana. I just finished my fieldwork and just finished my write-up, actually, so I can talk a little bit about some results. But yeah, so kind of looking at different non-lethal deterrence, as well as doing some occupancy modeling to kind of understand how some of these carnivores are moving from the Central Kalahari Game Reserve into these agricultural areas and some of the challenges that they may face. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm about. And if it's of interest, I can quickly show you guys some slides. So this is just kind of a map of Botswana to kind of give a sense of where I work. So over here is Namibia. This is the Kalahari. This is the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. It is one of the largest protected areas in Africa. I believe it's the second largest. It's about the size of the Netherlands. So it's enormous. Has huge populations of a lot of different species and obviously a really complicated history connected to that as well, which I can get into if that's of interest later as well. But then this is the Hansi farm block over here, which is mostly commercial farming. And over closer to Nukadi, that is more of a communal farming area. So kind of different farming systems, different concerns by those constituents. And then Hanzi, which is the capital of the Hanzi district, is right up here where the yellow dot is. So yeah, so that's kind of to give a sense of where I work. It's a semi-arid area. Some of the things I tested were flashing light systems called Fox lights. This is that device over there, which is yellow. It's not motion activated. It just essentially goes on when it senses light dim. So it is different than something like a motion activated spotlight. And it has randomized flashing patterns to kind of simulate someone walking around with a torch at night. So the idea is that hopefully that could be a non-lethal deterrent that would frighten carnivores away for a certain amount of time. And we tried to figure out, kind of tied to putting up camera traps, how this shifted different carnivores' behavior around crawls or livestock enclosures, and try to get a sense of how long does the effect last? Is there actually an effect? How does it shift things? And then why might that be the case? To give a sense of kind of what the study design was for this part of the thesis, there was a camera trap, which is the red dot, the fox light, which is the yellow dot on the crawl, so the livestock enclosure, and then we had a couple cameras out at 100 meters to try to see if the carnivores were actually shifting their behavior kind of from the crawl, moving out kind of towards a more kind of bushy area. Mostly jackal, which is probably no surprise to anyone who works in conservation in sub-Saharan Africa. We had a lot of jackal, but it was really interesting to kind of see some of those results from those guys. And I'm just going to show a couple camera trap pictures to get a sense of some of the critters that we saw. Brown hyenas, African wild dogs, which was really interesting. So there were definitely African wild dogs in the commercial farming areas. This is a serval. So there's only been a couple reported servals in this part of Hanzi, which was really exciting. So that was kind of a new finding. We also saw civet cats. What was interesting about this is like the idea is that they actually are shifting their behavior potentially because of artificial water sources. So they're adapted to kind of like these wetland areas, but with artificial water sources for cattle, they're moving further and further into the Kalahari, which is kind of interesting. Cheetah. So definitely saw some cheetah as well. And then healthy populations of leopards on the commercial farms. And we saw 5 individual leopards on this one commercial farm, but they only lost 2 calves over a calendar year. So it's interesting that it was actually quite low conflict despite kind of high populations of carnivores there. So that kind of gives you a small sense of kind of what some of the things I work on.
Thank you so much for that visual representation of your work and what you've been doing. We can see even the way you're describing and the types of images you've shown, you have great passion for the subject and the work that you're doing in Botswana. There's a question actually from you, or I guess someone who's using your profile in the chat. But like, what sparked your interest specifically for Southern Africa and studying human-wildlife conflict in this region?
Yeah, so in this region particularly, so my dad is Brazilian, but he's of West African descent. So I was always really interested in it because of that. So I think kind of that kind of sparked my interest in Africa, was kind of like this kind of secondhand cultural connection, a little bit through that. But then as I became more interested in human wildlife conflict, that was mostly because after habitat destruction, that's the highest impact on carnivore populations. And carnivores are kind of like these really important linchpins to the ecosystem. So if you remove them, the entire ecosystem suffers. So when I was a kid, I was kind of thinking like, how could I as one person maybe have like the most outsized impact? And the idea is with carnivores, you can actually make quite a big impact because they're low density. So if you can conserve them, you can help conserve the rest of the ecosystem. But it wasn't until I was in my undergrad that I was able to first speak to people who had actual impacts on their livelihoods from carnivores. And there was actually a pretty healthy Maasai population in Harrisonburg, Virginia at James Madison University, where I did my undergrad. And I met this master's student who I became really good friends with, Jacob Mariani. And he was really cool because he was able to explain kind of like, all right, but like, you can't just think from the animal's perspective. It's also really important to think from the farmer's perspective because they're the ones who are actually dealing with these impacts. And that really, I think, changed my mindset on that completely. And I realized I was looking at this the entire wrong way. And it was really important to try to put myself in that position and also listen to the people who are actually dealing with the problems on the ground. And yeah, from that point, I need to spend as much time communicating with people and understanding as possible to be able to hopefully connect to these issues better. And to kind of see myself as one tool of the toolbox, but not the entire toolbox. It's really important to work with people who have like direct experience with these carnivores and with these issues, and to actually listen to the farmers and try to find solutions with them rather than imposing upon them. So that's kind of like my evolution through that process. And I'm always learning and always trying to learn more. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Gabi, for that. And it's lovely to see how your heritage and who you are is also has influenced your passions and the work that you're currently doing. It's beautiful to see how you've sort of your journey and how it's evolved because of who you are. And I think it's something a lot of people can probably relate to in terms of passion and then following your passion through all the way to a PhD. And you're almost done. You said you're done with your write-up. So congratulations and kudos to you for that work, because it's a lot of work to be able to do that. So I want to go back to a word that you used during your introduction, interspecies diplomacy, where conservation has long been, framed around, conflict, militarization, or there's always like an undertone of conflict within the word conservation itself. So, I mean, how does the use of language such as diplomacy change how we fundamentally view human-wildlife conflict in your view and in the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think diplomacy, so the idea of interspecies diplomacy, the way kind of I think about it is there's kind of three tenets to it. There's empathy, compromise, and shared space. When you think of conservation, even the term, right? The term conservation, when you think of like conserving something, you're like, I'm going to use less water, or I'm going to like keep something apart from something else. So even the term of the field that I work in can have those connotations. And obviously human wildlife conflicts set things up to be more adversarial than it necessarily needs to be. So by stating diplomacy, I think it does a couple things. It kind of softens that. It makes it less adversarial. It makes us kind of think about animals as a party to these issues rather than something that we're against. Something they have their own needs and their own kind of like things that they bring to the table that unfortunately we have to infer as scientists, but that's kind of important to think of as well. And also diplomacy never ends, right? It's an ongoing process. It is ongoing compromise. Boundaries are continuously shifted as situations change. So that's another important thing about human wildlife conflict, is that people often ask, like, how do we fix human wildlife conflict? How do we solve it? What's the silver bullet solution? And that doesn't exist for anything, or, there is no, everything's so context dependent and everything's so constantly shifting that the question is, how can we kind of build a sustainable state of coexistence rather than expecting to completely, solve it and have it be done. So I think those are the kind of the things that are really important. I think it helps build empathy for wildlife as well, and try to find kind of what is the negotiation point that we can agree on, right, between these different parties.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, actually. And I hadn't thought about it until you started explaining how, even though diplomacy is often used from a human to human, between humans, like human interactions, it's actually something that we can change the framing from humans to animals, right? To see them as parties, or as you've said, actors who bring something to the table. And actually on that, traditional diplomacy involves listening, negotiation, compromise, right? And understanding different perspectives. But you see, with animals, they don't necessarily speak the same language as we do or communicate in the same way. So how do we bring wildlife to the negotiating table, as you have said? Do we begin by understanding what they need? Like how would we do that?
Yeah, so a lot of it, because we can't directly speak to wildlife in the same way, I think a lot of it is kind of understanding. So like when I test like a deterrent and say a jackal completely ignores it, right? That's them renegotiating, right? So it's kind of understanding these behavioral triggers and how they change. So getting a baseline idea of where animals are and how they move is really important. So as scientists, we do a lot of our research in protected areas because it, sometimes can be a little bit kind of like low-hanging fruit because there's already existing research and resources there. But the problem with that is that 80% of Africa's carnivores are outside protected areas, right? So they're in these agricultural areas where farmers also are, and they're having impacts from these carnivores that are often spilling from these protected areas into these agricultural areas. So when we're thinking of these kind of things, it's kind of trying to figure out, okay, where are they? How do they move? These very basic questions, right? How does that shift over time with either what people are doing, what climate change is doing, with resource allocations, things like that? And then behaviorally, how do things shift? So one thing that was really interesting to me, kind of looking at human-wildlife conflict, is it's really easy to see all jackals as one jackal, for example, right? Like they're all jackals, right? Because it's really hard to tell them apart visually. I can't do it. But different animals will react differently to deterrence. A younger jackal is more neophobic, which means that like they're often more afraid of deterrence than an older, more experienced animal. Or animals that are more active in communal cattle posts where there's a lot of people might be more habituated to people, and deterrence might not work as well as if it was in a more remote area. So these individual differences are also important with animals. And everybody kind of knows the story of like certain animals are more likely, there might be an individual who likes to go after livestock more than another individual. So I think trying to kind of like understand species, how species work together, but also kind of even drill it down to the individual level is also really important, because you're not dealing with, let's solve human wildlife conflict in Botswana. You're dealing with, in this cattle post, which has a few farming families, how do we deal with the carnivores that we know are here? So it's at these really small scale local things, which is why you need to work really closely with communities.
Absolutely. And I think we'll definitely get into communities in a bit. But actually, when you were speaking about the deterrence, like the differences in behavior between the older animals and the younger animals, excuse my lack of technical language here. I actually was, the question that was running through my mind was more of how do the, like, what role do the communities have, I think, with utilizing those deterrents and knowing how to, I guess, use them depending on the species of animal that they're dealing with. How were you able to navigate that?
Yeah, so that's where it goes into the whole kind of like animal perspective. Like trying to think from the animal perspective is like when you're thinking about deterrence, right? You're thinking about what does the animal see, hear, and potentially kind of like react to, and using that knowledge. So what's really interesting is that, obviously communities, they know these animals. They know them sometimes even individually, or they even give them names, different individuals, right? So knowing how communities kind of can like navigate these individual animals or individual species can be really helpful as a practitioner, because if you know, and also like working with farmers, right? So one thing that's really important is that, I think I said this in my TEDx talk, but when you're speaking with farmers and they're like, oh, I want to go shoot this leopard, it's like, but you know that leopard. If you shoot that leopard, you might get 3 leopards you don't know all fighting for the same territory, and that might be a bigger problem. So let's work with this one leopard. Let's try to figure out what this leopard is doing, and then try to adapt our strategies to what's actually going on your farm, not trying to take kind of like this general idea and then just blindly apply it to the local situation. So I think kind of it's that dialogue that's really important. Also kind of co-design. So I'll probably talk about this later, but the idea is that before you even set anything up, of course, it's not just asking permission. It's not like, can I be on your lands, which is of course important, but it's sitting down from the very beginning and saying, okay, where are the issues with the community? Because they know where things are. They know where the issues are. And having that co-design process is really important, because you might have a completely different idea of a different area to work, and they might be like, we don't actually have a problem with human wildlife conflict here. We have a problem with stock theft. We have a problem with disease, or we have a problem with drought. Like these things, it's not just human wildlife conflict. It could be other issues. So it's really important, and this is probably a theme that will come up a lot, is to not make assumptions about what the issues are, and to start kind of from that learning position of, all right, what are the problems, where are the problems, and where could I be most useful? if I'm useful at all, right? So I think that's kind of the process I usually try to take.
I love that you've been talking about also co-learning and building with the community, and we're gonna dive into that soon. I just want to read a comment from Holly Dublin, where she says, just a quick comment. In the engaged Buddhism practice of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, I hope I said that correctly, this relationship you are striving for is referred to as interbeing.
Very
Check it
cool.
out because his practice has a very wide and growing following, including among young Africans. And I
That's
think,
awesome.
right? Actually, it's my first time hearing about it. But in relation to that, the work that you're doing focuses on holistic and non-lethal deterrence. You've spoken about it a bit right now, but can you give us like examples of some of these deterrents? I remember you mentioned flashing lights. What other non-lethal innovations have you used, and what makes them effective?
Yeah, so there's lots. There's some that people are typically using. There's like barrier deterrence, like livestock enclosures. Honestly, I think the most effective thing to protect your livestock is people being engaged around where their livestock is. So actively kind of like bringing in your animals to the crawl after dark, which is a lot of people do, is really good. Crawls can be generally pretty effective. One thing that was really interesting is that, most of the loss happens when animals are out grazing, right? It doesn't actually happen in the crawl, which shows the effectiveness of like if you have something like a crawl or like a mobile crawl, if you're a pastoralist and you're moving around, that's a pretty low tech solution that can be really useful. I'm kind of starting kind of like from like lower tech to like higher tech. And the point I'm trying to make is that higher tech is not always better. Sometimes it's not effective or it, wouldn't work in a particular system. Um, so yeah, having good protective kind of like livestock husbandry methods, having healthy animals. Other things people do are like breeding for if they have protective mothers, breeding those mothers for cattle. So you have more protective cattle, or you're using particular breeds that are a little bit more aggressive, like Brahman cattle, for example, things like that. And I think for small stock, things like livestock guarding dogs can be really effective. In Botswana, it's kind of interesting because they don't bring in dogs from outside like you might see in Namibia with the big fancy, like Turkish livestock guarding dogs. They actually use local dogs, and those can be pretty effective as well. In one study, it was like almost equal effectiveness, I think, between the local dogs and then like these kind of like Kangal breeds or kind of like outside breeds. Um, so those are kind of like things that people use. A lot of people will use motion activated spotlights, which I actually think would work better than the Fox lights because they are motion activated. Audio deterrence, scent deterrence. People can actually use things like, this sounds a little funny, but like things like lion feces to scare away African wild dogs seems actually pretty promising. And they're actually trying to develop now like a scent of an African wild dog to try to keep other African wild dogs away because of territoriality. So like creating kind of that, isolating that biochemical compound and then using that scent. So again, it's trying to think about how animals work, right? How do animals respond to other animals in their environment? How do they respond to like the same species or to apex predators if they're kind of like lower down on the chain of command in terms of carnivores? Um, so there's lots of different things. Flashing light systems. Like I said, audio deterrence could be something as simple as people rattling pots and pans, coming out making noise, or it could be having kind of like a sound system set up where you could kind of toggle between, again, like maybe a lion roar or like people making noise kind of like as that. Um, and the big thing about all these things is that none of these things work amazing in isolation. You have to kind of use a wide variety of different deterrents because of something called habituation, which I'm sure I'll talk about more later. But basically, animals are very clever. Um, all animals are actually quite clever, and they learn very quickly that if there isn't an immediate consequence to a deterrent, like a farmer coming out or something that actually, they learn very quickly that it's not a problem. And the more experience they have, like again, the older animals or animals that are around people more, they learn faster. Um, so it becomes kind of this constant thing of like you can't just put one thing in place and expect it to work. You have to have good husbandry, but also be willing to change your methods and to talk to other farmers as well who might be like experimenting with different things and to also try those things on your farm. Yeah.
No, thank you for that, Gabby. Okay, when you were talking about lion feces, the first question I was like, how do you start collecting? Because I mean, shouldn't it be fresh, right? To have the
Right.
scent. So that means it has to have, you have to be following the lion. So you see where I'm
Yeah.
going with this?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, like the person who I know did it, one person did it from like a captive facility where they were able to get fresh lion feces. Another person did it collaborating with trackers. So just people who knew where lions were in, the national park and then collecting that and then applying it to farms. And actually it seemed to be pretty effective for a short period, which is kind of interesting, right? So, or with elephants, sometimes people will mix things like chilies or different kind of like scents to try to because they have such sensitive noses. Um, yeah, but like it's just really interesting about kind of like that constant evolution, right? You have to constantly be on top of your game. And I always say like any jackal is probably smarter than me because I'm constantly having to figure out new things with other people to try to stay ahead of them. But yeah, that's why I say like there is no silver bullet solution. It's the most important thing is collaborating with other people because the more brains you have together, the more you're able to come up with these different solutions.
So I'm hearing a lot about interdisciplinary engagement as well as different stakeholders to come up with solutions and even using different methods to make sure like the deterrents are actually working. I want to go back to habituation. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, sure. So habituation is basically an animal getting used to a stimulus. In this case, it would be a deterrent. So that basically means that maybe the first time you put out a deterrent, let's say we're using we can just go back to the flashing light example. We're using the flashing light. For a while, it works. Maybe jackals are a bit cautious to get close to a crawl that has a flashing light on it. And then they realize that nobody is coming out. There's no additional kind of like audio components. It doesn't alert the farmer, so the farmer's not coming out. There's no visual component to it apart from the flashing lights. And then by the second month, they're like, okay, nothing's going to happen to me if I come up to the crawl. And they kind of learn very quickly. So that's what habituation would be in that context.
And it's like it's almost like a behavioral science and understanding animals and the work that you've done. It sounds like it obviously takes months and years to understand how these animals react and how they've been interacting with the farmers and the different communities and that takes me to the community centering the community. And I see Stella has asked a question, but I want to ask this one and then get into Stella's question. You've worked in Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique. You've spoken about the importance of shifting from conservation being done from just purely science to also now engaging the communities, especially, for example, you've been speaking about farmers. What does genuine community-led conservation look like to you in practice?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of like a few different steps. The most important thing is kind of this collaborative agenda setting. So the idea is that before you even plan your research, for me, ethically as a researcher, I would not feel comfortable doing a study that would engage communities that wouldn't be useful to communities. It just wouldn't feel good to me as an individual. So for me, the first question isn't what do I want to learn? It's what would actually do some good. Like if I give some results back, what is actually helpful, right? And then from there, you learn what the research gaps are because they're like, okay, we know this, but we don't know that, right? And we're trying to learn this. And that can kind of help guide you. So I think kind of my first step would be to try to, and that could be connecting through local NGOs who work closely with communities if you don't have a direct connection. And then speaking like to these communities kind of like through those relationships or through kind of maybe traditional meetings or things like that, kind of trying to connect to different communities like that. And then trying to figure out, okay, what's the problem? What's useful? And then what questions kind of come out of that that I could maybe answer with my research. And then from that, like kind of figuring out, making sure that they're active owners and directors of the project and not just observers or people that you report to. I think a lot of researchers do come in and they're like, okay, this is the results from my research. thanks guys, and that's not really enough, right? Like it's not really enough, and it shouldn't really be kind of like the base standard that we aspire to. Like we really should kind of like do a bottom up approach. And I think local leadership should also be able to, in conversation, alter, veto things as well. Maybe they're like, this is not something we want to be involved in, or they're like, we want to adjust the methodology here because it's better for us. And it's really up to the researcher then to like listen to that and then kind of adjust plans around that. Also, the important thing is to kind of value this traditional ecological knowledge as well, to try to understand what people already know and then adapt your research around those principles. So for example, a lot of people will know kind of like how animals move on their land, or they might be like, they used to move in this direction from here, and in the last 10 years, as it's gotten more dry, they're moving in this way, right? Or like, we used to not have any human wildlife conflict issues in this area, and now they're all coming here. And the question then as a researcher goes like, okay, but why, right? But you wouldn't know that unless you directly worked with people. So understanding kind of like this ecological knowledge that people already hold is really important. Or you might come in with all these ideas and they're like, we tried that. We tried that already, or like this NGO 10 years ago came in and it didn't work, right? So like, I think that's really important. Also kind of working into like this internal reporting. So making sure that it's not just being funneled back to the States or wherever you're going, or, the university that you're working with, away from the communities. It's this internal reporting where you're having regular meetings with communities and reporting to them first. It's also working directly to have people from the community working with you in that research, I think is really important as well. So there's a sense of ownership. So there's people who are not just setting up the camera traps, but helping you kind of design where the camera traps go, right? Like you're coming in with your knowledge about, what's a good process of setting up a camera trap, but they know where the animals are, right? So they're like, okay, we know that jackals come through this dry wash, so let's set it up here. If you're not working with people from the community, how would you know that? So I think that's really important. And then also kind of like de-jargonizing findings. So one big thing that I always like to ask is, what's the most useful format for me to give you guys results or to talk about the process, right? Is it, me doing a presentation? Is it me doing a video? Is it me doing some kind of interactive forum where people can ask questions? Like, what is the most useful way to share that information? And I think that's kind of like, that would be the process for me. So it's engaging people, not even just engaging, but it's kind of knitting the community into the fabric of the research from the very beginning all the way to the end. And not just engaging them at the very end of the process to very passively kind of pass off the results.
And it's lovely to hear how you've also intertwined yourself within the community, the way they do things. It's to me, it sounds like that's how you are also just adapting your methodologies. It's because, as you've said, it's the bottom-up approach is the co-creation, the learning, the adapting, the observations that you're doing, and it's wonderful to hear. And while we're still here, Sela's question is, when a livestock owner has just lost a calf or a herd of goats to a predator, emotions are understandably running extremely high. In those raw moments, how do you approach a conversation as a researcher so that the farmer feels heard and respected rather than feeling like an outsider is taking the animal's side?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. The first thing I do is I listen. I mean, sometimes it will be uncomfortable and people will want to vent to you about how difficult the situation is, and you listen and you try to understand from their perspective, which I think is really important, because if somebody had killed my cow, I'd be really upset too, and it's not an abstract thing. I think it's really easy for outside researchers to be like, lions are cool, nobody should kill lions. But if you're living with lions or you're living with these carnivores, it can be a real safety risk, and people live with a good sense of like anxiety and opportunity costs, because we're spending so much time trying to protect their livestock or even themselves or their children, right? So that's why it can't just be thinking from the animal's perspective. So I think the most important thing you can say in those moments is, I hear you, what can I do to try to improve this situation? And maybe there's cases where they're just like, take the animal away. And then you could say, but it's likely to come right back. Or they'll be like, shoot the animal. And you'll be like, then you might have more of those animals coming in. So what can I do that might have a longer term impact? But before you even get to the let's fix it, the most important thing is to just sit there and try to understand what they're going through, without jumping to it. Because then if you just jump to solutions, people will not feel heard, or they'll feel like you're just trying to, save the leopard or whatever it was, when it's more just like, no, like this is a real big problem. And I can hear that it's a huge, big problem. So I want to stop you losing your animals. Help me do that. Let's work together to do that.
And I love how you engage with locals as experts as much as you're an expert.
Yeah.
Sorry, just I was getting a call.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it was a great question. Thank you so much for that, Sela. And around this topic about, the community as well as the type of technologies that you've been using with your projects and in your work. We always speak about funding as something, that's obviously necessary, all right, to be able to do to do this kind of work. So many projects, especially with donors around conservation, they're evaluated using short-term measurable outputs. However, your research and your work, it's a long-term game. You have to build community relationships. You have to, observe, animals over time. Especially with technologies that you've deployed, etc. It's about building relationships even with the animals themselves. So how can conservationists better convince funders or donors in our various fields to invest in these long-term and more complex approaches that are not earmarked by strict deadlines and outputs?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to kind of communicate to funders that quick fixes look really nice on a report, but they won't last. And it's not worth investing in things that won't work over time. So it's trying to change these kind of key performance indicators into something that they can kind of see and track over time. So that could be, instead of infrastructure built, it could be, how have people's perceptions of carnivores changed over time? How have their husbandry practices changed over time? How can we kind of like do these adaptive management approaches? It could be measuring landscape occupancy over time by wildlife, so people can see, okay, well, like if we have these different approaches in place, we're seeing more wildlife over time shifts kind of like coming into these areas and be able to, maybe persist in areas where they weren't able to persist before because people have better livestock practices or even more resources, right? That could be another problem as well. Maybe they have all the knowledge, but they don't have necessarily the resources to be able to up any kind of defenses in terms of like crawl development or predator-proof fencing or things like that. It could be, I think the biggest thing to also talk about is just like the financial waste of like these short-term fixes. So it could even be looking in terms of like, okay, you're investing in fox lights, but you're not even testing habituation, which a lot of people don't. They put it up for like a month and then you're not actually testing if it works long term. So what is the cost of investing in that technology? What is the cost of, building relationships that only last a month and then nothing happens, right? So kind of trying to convince them through that and showing cost savings from preventing conflict over time. Also kind of doing more milestone-based grants, I think could be important. So kind of like looking at things instead of like putting 5 fox lights out, yay, funders are happy, kind of looking at these milestones of like, all right, let's try to negotiate for like a 3-year project. And we have developed milestones over time to see actually we're putting these out. Is it working? If that's not working, what is our secondary plans and things like that? And kind of pitching this long-term stability over temporary crisis management. Because really it doesn't do farmers any good or carnivores any good if we're just essentially putting things out to look good on paper or to be able to talk about it on social media without having kind of that long-term idea. So I think just being honest, saying this is a long-term project. It will take multiple years. But the payoff and the cost benefit analysis shows that if we invest into this community, if we invest into these solutions, we are going to see a much better use of that funding than if we just essentially threw something at the wall, see if it stuck, and then left after 2 months.
Thank you for that, and thank you for showing that layered approach and how to deal with aspects of funding. Because I think a lot of people in the room would probably have that challenge on trying to show the benefits of the long-term game as opposed to a 6-month project that they want to see quick and or easy results. And speaking of results, you have something that you've developed, innovation beyond science, right? One of the most actually fascinating aspects of your work that you've co-founded a game studio that develops picture-based video games for rural communities. It's a very unconventional but like really interesting approach to what you've been doing. So what inspired this idea? Can you talk us or walk us through what it is? Because it's a very innovative approach and I'd love to hear more about it. And I'm sure everyone is wondering what I'm talking about. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we have an independent game studio, which is a little bit on hold while I'm doing my PhD, but we are working on a current project, which I'll talk about soon. The idea is when I was a kid, believe it or not, I was really shy, really, really shy. So I started doing a lot of theater to try to get more comfortable with engaging with people and with public speaking because I would be terrified, like I had like major stage fright. And I learned that interactivity is such a powerful tool to learn, but also to kind of practice kind of like seeing from other people's perspectives. So that really got me interested in kind of like interactive medium as being potentially more effective than just kind of telling people information. And then I met my best friend who is a game designer, and I was thinking, hey, if we have a game, we can kind of simulate all these different scenarios or have people play it and test these different things out with no direct impact on them. They're not losing goats by testing these things out. They can test it in the game and see what the consequences are and like how we could play these out. And then maybe that can help people kind of think in these different ways and learn kind of more in a more engaging way than just kind of doing a formal presentation. So that's kind of the idea. And we were like, we can do it, but we're broke because we're college students and we have no money or funding. So we actually didn't have any investors. We literally got free software. We built the game using clip art from PowerPoint. And the big thing that was a real challenge is that I'm like, what use is a game if it's only in English? It's not useful, right? Because like people have so many different languages, right? So like we can't just have it only in English or it's not going to be applicable or playable by a lot of different people. So we're like, what if we made it without language and it was only pictorial, right? Where it could essentially be played by anybody. And what if we made it where it didn't depend on internet? It was a downloadable thing, right? So that's kind of like what we developed. And we developed this game called Operation Ferdinand, which had 3 mini games. The first was essentially kind of like building a good livestock enclosure. So people could kind of try different things out with the livestock enclosure. And then like if you left gaps, then a jackal would come in, or like if you didn't do these different things, there'd be consequences, right? And then there was a timer. So people had to figure out what was wrong with the livestock enclosure and fix it before the timer was up. Sorry, I'm talking for a bit. Second game was like CSI Predator. So the idea was essentially like you see like a cartoon cow, and then there'd be like bite marks, and then there'd be like scat. So predator poo. So then like a carnivore footprint. And they had to figure out what carnivore made that footprint. So what we did is we developed this thing. And then we cold emailed like different NGOs. So we emailed a bunch of different people, and we ended up working really closely with Nyasa Carnivore Project in Mozambique. And what was really interesting is that she was all for it, Colleen Begg, who was the founder of it. And she was testing it with her communities that she was working with in her education program. And then the communities would have feedback for us. this didn't make sense. This, I didn't really understand the point of this, or this wasn't really interesting to me. And then we would take all that information and we'd fix it, right? We'd fix the game up, we'd send it back. She would test it more people, send it back. And it was this collaborative approach to develop it.
Well, it's really amazing and great work. And the question that Stella had was, is it available and is the access free? Or where can we
Yeah.
get where can we get this game?
Yeah, so I need to update the link for downloads, but it should be available. I need to see if it's updated for the latest software for PC.
So I'm excited. I'm gonna check it out as soon as we're done.
Yeah.
I used to like gaming. I don't game that much anymore, but it's a very innovative and fun way to engage people. And I love how you also tested it out with local communities on the ground through your colleague and friend who was able to say, okay, to take it to them, and then they were able to also help you think through some of the processes in the game. That's pretty cool.
It's fun. Yeah, the current game that we're working on right now is actually kind of exciting. It is basically about supply chains. So I don't know if you guys have ever done like an avatar thing where like you dress your avatar and you make your avatar look like a certain way.
Well, like Sims.
Like Sims, like The Sims. Yeah. So the idea is that it's like an app that people can kind of pick their clothing for their avatar, and then they learn what the true cost of that clothing is. So then they learn about through the environmental supply chain, what was all the things that it took to kind of make that clothing happen, what was the impact on the environment. So the idea is to try to convince people to do healthier choices when they see kind of like the impact. So yeah, so that's kind of what we work on.
Oh, wow. I actually quite like that idea because I think it helps you also embody the cost of actually of what it is that you're thinking of doing. So that's a great idea. No,
Thank
really,
you.
I'm inspired. Really, Gabby, amazing work. So I just want to go to Eric's question. It's unrelated, but I think maybe if you're able to answer, he's asking carbon. What can you say about carbon credits in relation to wildlife and livestock grazing?
That is a really good question, and it's not really my field, unfortunately. I can't say a ton about that. Um, but I do think like there's a lot of this kind of like opens up kind of a bigger question about like I guess incentives for people to do certain livestock husbandry things. While I can't talk about carbon credits 'cause I don't feel comfortable kind of like extending into a field that not I don't know as much about. Um, in my particular kind of subsection of conservation biology, one thing a lot of people are trying to do now is like instead of compensation policies for when people are losing livestock, it's it's like compensation policies connected to how many carnivores are seen on camera traps or how many like prey species are seen on camera traps. So kind of like indirect things rather than like directly kind of like trying to pay people back for their livestock. I don't know if anyone's here from Botswana, but there's a lot of talk about kind of like the national compensation policy and kind of like the issues with that. And I'm sure it's common kind of all over the world where there's some issues with compensation policies not covering the full amount of livestock and things like that. So trying to kind of come up with other ways, working with communities about like, okay, how can we kind of remove it being necessarily tied to loss of livestock and more just like if you're living with these animals, you should be compensated, but in what way and like what's most useful and how can communities like choose where that compensation goes? How can we kind of make it into like a more community-wide thing? Those are some of the conversations that people are having.
And I love that conversation, and it leads. And I think you answered that question well, even though carbon credits are not your space. Um, but in terms of I know that you're a strong advocate for diversity and equity within STEM, so science, tech, engineering, and I believe mathematics. But yeah, STEM, right? So, in your own words, why is diversity so important in conservation and bringing different perspectives and ideas? How do they lead to better outcomes?
I think There is a long answer and a short answer. I think the short answer is the more people from different perspectives you have in the room, the more people who are working together, who can bring their experiences from different, backgrounds in general, you're going to come up with better solutions. Because you're going to have people who can speak to other stakeholders kind of from a direct perspective, for example. Like, for example, if you have a men-only team, how they communicate with women is going to be different than having women speak to women. If you have a team that is only people from not the communities, how they speak to the communities is going to be different, than having a team made up of people who are also from that community, right? So I think that's really important. These intersectional teams are more effective and more creative and more collaborative in my experience. It also helps you identify like blind spots in project design. So like I said before, if you are a team of people who are just from outside the community or even from outside the country, you're going to have these gaps in project design that could be potentially harmful or not useful, right? So I think that's also another really important reason. And having people that have this lived experience kind of in these areas is really important to help design these interventions because for a couple of reasons, it's more likely to be more effective kind of from a context specific basis because it's made for that place. It's not saying, okay, I worked in Kenya with this community, I'm just going to pop it into Botswana. Like it's not going to work, right? But if you're working with people who are kind of coming up with the interventions with you for that particular place, it's more likely to be effective and it's more likely to be used because it works within kind of like a practical or a cultural context that people are comfortable with. So it kind of creates that sense of like, ownership. It's also their intervention. And then when the foreign researcher goes home, or the academic goes home, they're the ones who are using that deterrence. So if they came up with it, and if they feel that they can easily access ways to do it, then they're more likely to use it and it's more likely to be effective than if somebody just imposes something on them, which is A, unethical, and B, probably not going to be used long term. And I see this whole idea of just kind of like breaking this legacy of fortress conservation, literally taking down the walls between conservationists and between the communities that we're hopefully working with, because the idea is that there is harm that was perpetuated from conservationists. When you're working with a community, they've dealt with conservationists before, so there's a legacy there that could have been harmful. And maybe if you're coming in from the outside, you don't know what that is and you don't know what the history behind that is, but it does exist, right? So it's important to try to break down those barriers to understand kind of like what the history is and to try to do better. Even though it might have not been you personally who did that, it still exists, right? And also the idea of there should be local champions, people who have, the excitement around these projects. If you're working with communities, maybe one of those individuals really becomes the leader of that long term, and long term is leading these innovations on the ground. Like what I'm hopeful is that, like, again, I'm one tool in the toolbox. I'm maybe, I don't know, like a crescent wrench or something. I am not the toolbox. So eventually I'm not going to be on the ground anymore. I'm hopeful that I can impart what skills I have. But long term, the people who should be leading those innovations should be the people who live there and who have that knowledge and who hopefully have the passion to, protect what is theirs, that carry on long term. So I think kind of like that's why I think diversity is important, is because it's the only way conservation will be sustainable.
Absolutely. Sustainability is actually the goal because we want it to be long term and over generations. And I'm just seeing where the time is, and I'm grateful for the wisdom and the exciting experience that you've shared with us. But we have a question from Philippa Rowe, and I would love to read it. I saw the one from Sela. Let's see how we go here. But Philippa says, any tips to avoid drawing predators or any wildlife to artificial water sources? As droughts extend, presumably animals approaching resort pools, cattle drinking water, or any water in homes becomes more likely as fauna becomes more desperate. So is securing water with a lid sufficient, or are the animals too smart? How do you feel about alternative artificial watering holes?
That's such a good question. That's such a complex one. Yes, they are drawn to water holes. As I mentioned with servals, even species that wouldn't be in certain areas are extending into more arid areas because there is that water available for them. I think in general, animals are quite clever, and if you have water, they're going to get at it. It is complicated also from not just like a potential predation standpoint, but also from a sense of disease spread, right? Because there could be zoonotic diseases that they spread between animals. So I think the idea is not necessarily to try to prevent carnivores from using water, because it's very difficult to do that, but it's to understand, and maybe this is something where camera trapping or things can be really useful, or just having people observe, is when do these animals use the water, right? So kind of getting a sense of like, okay, so they're coming mostly at night. So maybe we try to adapt kind of when we allow our animals kind of like into kind of like the water points, or we water them at different times, or we have somebody kind of go out with them. Maybe there's a night shift person who goes out with them and kind of like watches them while they're doing that. So kind of understanding where they go, but also like when are they most active can be effective. Or trying to create kind of like alternate maybe water sources, that are away from crops, that also could be potentially useful. But yeah, I think trying to, especially in arid areas, just kind of completely cut it out, that's not possible. So I think thinking about temporally, like what time, how do they interact is really important. I will say that, when I was looking at my camera trap things, there were the leopards were active when the cattle weren't. So I didn't see cattle with the leopards in the pictures. But then you see things like greater kudu and cattle drinking side by side, which could be a problem with disease risk, in which case, okay, we know that kudu are drinking next to cattle, so let's make sure we're vaccinating our animals for things that we know that greater kudu could maybe be a vector for. So it's also kind of understanding like what other animals are also interacting with your cattle or with your small stock, and not just thinking about carnivores and thinking about ways that you can kind of keep your whole herd healthy, um, as well. Because I think a lot of times people tend to blame predation as the biggest issue when actually like zoonotic disease can be even more devastating. So yeah. I hope that was a good answer for the question. That's a really complex topic.
No, of course. And I've learned a lot. I actually hadn't thought about, wild animals being vectors for disease. Because I was like, oh, well, if the animals are thirsty, I mean, but actually you're making sense. I mean, it makes sense that, you don't want your livestock to be interacting with, these animals just in case, they are carrying something. So the
Right.
last question for the evening is from Sela, and she just says, what are some of the unexpected or hidden factors like herding traditions among youth or delayed government compensation that may drive human predator conflict far more than just the animal behaviors themselves?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So when I think of human wildlife conflict, I like to think of it as human conflict, in some ways, because you're thinking about kind of like a history, right? So one things that really drive things are history of conservation, history with government. A lot of the times people don't like carnivores not just because they eat their livestock, but because maybe they felt deprioritized by the government. Or maybe the whole idea of like the compensation policy, it could lead to frustration if they're expecting, like an equal market amount and they're getting 30% back, or it's the payments late, or like people are not really verifying things appropriately. There could be a lot of issues with that. So I think a lot of it is frustration between stakeholders, can drive a lot of human wildlife conflict, right? And that's something that, again, working within the community is really important because you can understand that, because you talk to people and you're starting to slowly understand kind of like the history of how all these things came to place. Um, but if you're just kind of looking at it, we're like, okay, lions like to eat cows, I'll just stop lions from eating cows, problem solved, then it's not getting at those issues. Um, so I think that's a big factor. Also, how people see different carnivores differs culturally. Sometimes people dislike certain carnivore species disproportionately to the issues that they cause because of the way that, like, for example, African wild dogs will rip living animals apart. Farmers really don't like that. So maybe like they only lose a few cattle to them and they lose a lot of things to leopard or the jackal, but they hate African wild dogs more. So I think it's really important not to just think that, you know, the direct loss of the livestock is the only factor or the driving factor behind how people think about different carnivores. And also not to think that farmers necessarily, even farmers that don't like carnivores, some carnivores, might have positive connotations for them as well. So like making sure you're not thinking about like, okay, everyone's either negative or positive. You either like them or you don't, right? It's like most people are kind of ambivalent, where they're like, I like them, but in the reserve. Or I like them if they didn't eat my cows. Or, you know, so like I think it's really important to not simplify things at a community or at a individual level. So yeah, because the whole idea is that like I've been saying community a lot because it's easy, right? But every individual is different. Every individual has their different kind of like thoughts about how carnivores are, their different histories, their different, you know, cultural perspectives or, you know, individual perspectives or lived experience. So you really have to get out and talk to people on a one-to-one basis and not kind of see things as a monolith. Yeah, and again, none of this is fast and none of this is easy, but this is what I think works, rather than these very short things. Yeah.
And I really want to thank you, Gabi, for bringing a holistic perspective and viewpoint of the work that you've been doing, from technology to community engagement to the gaming that you've been using to animal behavioral science at the core of what it is. And I think I've learned a lot today just from hearing you about habituation, about the types of technologies you've been using, about diplomacy within human wildlife coexistence, and the language that you've used. And what I've learned, at least one of the key takeaways, honestly, for me is the diplomacy part and how that like filters through everything that you're doing, just using that framing and understanding coexistence and empathy for the animals themselves and for the communities that live with them. So thank you so much, Gabi, for bringing your wisdom, your insight. And I would never have thought ever in my wildest dreams that you were shy and you weren't a good public speaker, because you nailed this. I mean, absolutely amazing. And obviously you did a TED Talk. You're a TED speaker. Come on. I mean, you did so well. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Just a big round of applause for Gabi. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And just as a final hoorah, like, what are your call to action for the audience? Your call to action.
My call to action is, if you can think from someone else's perspective, you will be a good conservationist. And if you can listen, those are the two tools. Trying to understand where people are coming from, where other things are coming from. And also my other takeaway is that if you're hearing, hearing from a city and you're like, this doesn't really apply to me, it does, because, you know, wildlife can be insects, it can be birds, it can be the fruit flies that hang out on your bananas in your kitchen. So try to think about that. You know, you don't want the fruit flies eating your fruit and they're sitting there. That's human wildlife conflict. That's an opportunity to try to think about interspecies diplomacy. So no matter who you are, you can apply this to your daily life, and hopefully we can have a little bit more of a, I guess, sustainable future together.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, we're all conservationists in our spheres of influence, even if it's in urban areas. That spider, that one you've been eyeing in your bedroom, don't kill it. It's part of the world.
Probably keeping mosquitoes away from you. So yeah.
Exactly. That's what I say. People don't believe me. They're like, it's a spider. Oh my word, Gabi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this.